3 in our World War II series. This lecture is called East. There isn't a sheet for the lecture notes, so grab either a blank piece of paper or just write on the back of one of your lecture note pages. You can use the Fortress of the Clouds one, and I'll tell you what to write down. East. Okay, the Battle of Britain is over. The Royal Air Force won. So Britain successfully repels the Nazi air campaign. As a result of this, Hitler has to cancel Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned Nazi invasion of the British Isles. Now, that will always be a thorn in Hitler's side, that Britain stands there defiant, but Britain is in no position to reinvade France. Britain is in no position to really oppose Hitler in any meaningful way. As long as they stay on their island, there'll be a thorn in his side, kind of sitting there waiting to strike if Hitler ever became weak. But it doesn't actually stop Hitler's big plan. Hitler's big plan is the creation of a Third Reich, and you're going to want to write that down. So what is the Third Reich? Well, the Third Reich is his idea of a great German empire. This implies the existence of a second and even a First Reich. The First Reich was the Roman Empire, the original. The Roman Empire was this great empire that ruled over most of the known world in the West and had lasting influence, and it lasted a very long time. You should know that. And then it fell in the 450s when the Visigoths sacked Rome. So a Second Reich is popped up in the German Prussian lands, and it's called the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire has nothing to do with the First Roman Empire. They just really liked the idea of emulating the Roman Empire. So what was it? It was a super state of independent kingdoms that occupied most of, modern day Germany and other countries as well. And they all collectively kind of worked together as a unified state, even though they were independent kingdoms. The Holy Roman Empire falls apart during the Napoleon campaigns, during Napoleon's conquest of Europe. That's the end of that. Hitler wants a third major German empire, and he wants it to last 1,000 years. He wants it to be the greatest of them all. So how is he going to achieve this? Well, Lebensraum, living space, is the plan. We are going to acquire fertile land, and this Third Reich is going to expand. You cannot build a giant superstate without expansion. So, in order to meet these criteria, Hitler has his eyes on 3 things. The first is Ukraine. Write this stuff down. Ukraine equals food. Ukraine's ability to feed Europe is unparalleled. They're the breadbasket of really the world. They don't just make enough food to feed their country. They feed much of Europe, much of Russia. They feed Africa. They export their grain all over the place. Ukraine is known for very fertile black soils and endless wheat fields, very productive wheat fields. And so with access to that food supply, Hitler could feed a growing empire. And he wants his empire to be wealthy. And so when he sees the Caucasus, he sees what will feed industry. Write this down. Caucasus equals oil. Europe does not have a lot of oil. It actually has a bit of a shortage of oil, but it is one of the most industrialized places in the world, and industry needs oil. So by taking the Caucasus, he can take the productive oil fields there and use it to fuel the economic expansion of his German superstate. The next thing that he will need is laborers, and Slavs equal slaves. And if you think Slavs look like the word slaves, you're right. That is the root of the word slave, Slav. So who are the Slavs? The Slavs are the Slavic people. It's a culture and language group. And Russians belong to the Slavic culture, along with Serbians and a lot of other Central and Eastern Europeans. And so Hitler, remember, believes, and he wrote this down in Mein Kampf, Hitler believes that the Germans are a supreme race, and he believes that the Slavs are not. And so these less thans can labor for their betters. So we need to look at the map. In the center is Germany. They've already annexed Austria, they've already taken over France and set up Vichy France, and they've started their expansion. They failed to take Britain. That was Operation Sea Lion. It's now canceled. So the Battle of Britain over the English Channel, failure. So Britain will be a thorn in the back of Hitler's side. This is where his attention is focused next. Where I'm pointing on the screen, this is Ukraine. Ukraine is where all the food is. Over here, these are the Caucasus. And the Caucasus region is where all the oil is in Europe. Now there's a problem. None of this is inside of German territory. This whole area is the USSR. That's the Soviet Union. That is all run by our dictator friend Joseph Stalin. Now Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact just prior with Joseph Stalin. And everybody knew it wouldn't last very long, but it's going to last long enough for everybody to get their goals met. So, what to do? All of what Hitler wants is in friendly Soviet Union territory, and he's promised that he's never going to bother them. We all know what Hitler's promises are worth. So, we need to talk about the Soviet Union for a second and what's been going on in there. What's been going on is a bit of a disaster. You need to write down the Winter War. The Winter War is important, not because it's this big like geopolitical change or anything. It was mostly a Soviet incursion into Finland. And the Soviets will win this war. It'll last just under a year, about one winter long. But what it shows and the rippling effects it has on World War II matter. So, Stalin's purges had crippled the military. We need to talk about the Red Army, because the mighty Red Army of the Soviet Union, it has some problems. And the first problem is that Joseph Stalin is a new and young dictator. New and young dictators are not established and do not have full control over everything. Stalin has competition. Stalin has threats from within the Soviet Union. And no dictator faces any greater threat than from their own military. If you think about it, what more competent person can you think of that could coordinate a campaign or a coup d'etat to depose him, that could seize, all the important cities and force somebody to step off the throne? Military generals and high-ranking military officials have always been threats to dictators. And so you either need to put your people in charge of the military or you need to weaken the military. And so Stalin does both. He does both. He fires or jails or executes all of the old senior command of the Red Army. And so when all of these old commanders and generals, the ones that won the Russian Revolution, won the Russian Civil War, they all go away. And they're replaced with yes men, people that are loyal to Stalin. As a result of that, his military is not run by the best, most experienced officers. It's run by the most loyal. And they might not be the most experienced. In fact, most of them are incompetent. And then Stalin invades the Soviet Union. Or then the Soviet Union invades Finland. And so what happens? Well, what happens is the Red Army bungles the whole operation. They are disorganized, they are slow, they are unstructured. And the Finns extract a very, very high cost. You guys know what Molotov cocktails are? Those little glass bottles filled with fuel with rags sticking out. You light the rag on fire and you huck the bottle, and when it shatters, fuel goes everywhere and causes an explosion. Those are invented during the Winter War. The Finns are quite crafty and hardy, and they don't like the idea of being occupied by the Soviet Union. So they fight. And so as tanks start rolling down the streets, people start throwing Molotov cocktails and other improvised weapons out the windows of their apartment complexes. Now, what good is a little fire against a tank? Well, it's actually really, really good, because the weakness of a tank is that it's a lot like a car. It runs using an engine. Fuel and air are required. If you build a fire on the back of a tank, throwing Molotov cocktails, you burn up all that oxygen that the engine needs to run. This will stall the motor and bring the tank to a stop. And it's a good thing that you've saved a few Molotovs, because as that tank starts to warm up and get smoky inside, that crew is going to open the hatch and get out. And that's when you throw the rest of your Molotovs. So the Finns are able to extract a very high cost, and they delay the Soviet expansion, and the Soviets do not get everything that they wanted. However, the Soviets do win this war. So, why would the Soviet Union invade Finland in the first place? Let's look at this map again. Right up here is Leningrad. That's what the city's called now. It used to be called Petrograd during the Russian Revolution, and prior to that it was called St. Petersburg. This is where the Bolshevik Revolution first started. This is where Bloody Sunday protests were. This is where the Winter Palace was. Why here? Why is this city so important? Well, it's one of the big industrial hubs. This is where Russia has the ability to make their money. And primarily the reason is it's one of the only ports they have. Russia's problem geographically is that they're a monstrous, huge country, largest in the world by landmass, but they have very little access to the oceans. And the oceans is how you trade with the rest of the world. That's how money is made. Moving stuff around on land is very slow and very expensive versus putting it on a boat and sailing out to the rest of everybody else's ports. And so this port here is super important. And it freezes over half the year, and it's right here on the Finnish border. And so the Soviet Union wants to push into Finland and expand their own borders, expand their own influence up here in the Baltic. But it doesn't work very good. The Red Army struggles to take over Finland, and they don't even get the whole thing. Finland makes some concessions and they lose some territory, but they remain kind of an independent people. And the Finns are pissed. They now hate the Russians. They used to consider themselves part of the Russian Empire, but after this Russian Winter War invasion, they've soured on the whole idea of the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin in general. So Stalin has now made enemies out of what were somewhat allies, all because he's trying to expand influence up here. So, Stalin sees that the Red Army needs to be reformed, that it is not as strong as it should be. So hopefully from here you have written down Winter War, purges crippled military. Stalin needs reforms. Now, Stalin looks at the Red Army and the sad, sorry shape it's in and realizes that they are not fit for a fight. Somebody else notices that too. Adolf Hitler sees the performance of the Soviet Union during the Winter War, and he realizes that if Stalin is allowed time to reform the Red Army, then the Red Army will be difficult to deal with in the future. But if we were to invade now, then the Red Army would not be able to oppose the Nazis. All Hitler has to do is kick in the front door, and the whole rotten structure will come crumbling down. And so Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa. That is something you should definitely write down. Operation Barbarossa. All right. June 1941. Surprise. Hitler invades the Soviet Union. That non-aggression pact, everybody knew it wouldn't hold, but Stalin was not expecting this. This comes as a surprise. There is no warning, there is no talks, there is no threats, there is only blitzkrieg, and it is a complete surprise. They start with the Soviet half of Poland. The Nazi war machine plows right through the Russian lines. Primarily, it is a combination. It's called combined arms. It is these three things. It is artillery barrages, followed by airstrikes, followed by mobile mechanized armor divisions, blitzkrieg style. These three things are more than the Red Army can cope with. They are not organized enough to put up with a blitzkrieg. And so these blitzkriegs smash right through the front lines of the Red Army. Stalin is not ready for this war. He has not been preparing for this war. The Red Army is not well practiced or well disciplined or well led. They're not even well supplied. But Stalin has no choice but to send everything that he has to stop the Nazis. Otherwise, they're going to plow straight through and seize everything. And the reason is because Operation Barbarossa is the biggest invasion in the history of the world. Hitler has assembled the largest army ever recorded, and he has sent the entire thing straight at Joseph Stalin, straight at the Red Army that is not ready to receive it. 4 million soldiers. More tanks than anybody has ever faced. Armored fighting vehicles, aircraft, artillery, mortars, horses and vehicles for supply and running shells back and forth. And all of this working together, a well-practiced, well-oiled machine that has already taken over a half a dozen countries all throughout Europe. They're experienced, they're efficient, and they're deadly. And there's more of them than anybody thought possible. Hitler has built the biggest and most effective fighting force in the world. And it's all coming straight for Stalin. These are Hitler's goals. He's going to launch these three major offensive groups. The first place they're going to head is Kiev. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. This is the food supply. Stalin cannot afford to lose it. If Stalin loses Kiev and loses Ukraine, he loses access to all that wheat and all that grain, and his cities will starve. Leningrad. This is another target. Stalin cannot afford to lose Leningrad at all. Leningrad is their access to the sea in the north. It is a major industrial hub. It would cripple the Russian economy to lose Leningrad. It would cripple their industry to lose Leningrad. We know about Moscow. Moscow is the seat of government. It is the capital of the Soviet Union. That's where the Kremlin is. That's basically, the house of Stalin. You cannot lose your capital. And this city used to be called Volgograd, but it is so important that Stalin has decided to name it after himself. It is now called Stalingrad. This gray line here is the Volga River. The Volga River can be used to transport, kind of like, boats on the ocean, boats down the river. This is a river that runs through the industrial heartland of Russia. And Stalingrad sits on both sides of the river. The city straddles both sides of the river. River runs through it, is what I'm saying. And it is a very important connection. It's an industrial city where a lot of factories and a lot of wealth is generated, and it is the major supply hub that guards the Caucasus, where all the oil is. So, you cannot lose the food, you cannot lose your economy, and you cannot lose your capital. And now the largest and most deadly army Europe's ever seen is coming straight for them. The Luftwaffe does not struggle like they did in the Battle of Britain. They achieve air superiority immediately, within days. The Soviet planes were all destroyed on the runways. A lot of them never even took off. And the ones that did were completely overpowered by these veteran, experienced Luftwaffe pilots and planes. 3,000 Soviet planes are destroyed in the first couple days. Most of the Soviet Air Force is just wiped out. And so the Luftwaffe has free reign of the skies. And air superiority is one part of the combined arms idea of Blitzkrieg. You need artillery, air superiority, and armored invasion forces on the ground. Because they lose air superiority, the Luftwaffe can bomb and strafe whatever they want from the skies, and the Soviets can do nothing about it. The Soviet resistance cannot handle the blitzkriegs. What's worse is their coordination, organization, and logistics are so bad. Their ability to move around their country is so bad that they can't even retreat out of the way fast enough. Hitler says, before 3 months have passed, we will witness a collapse of Russia. And it looks to be the case. It looks like the Soviet Union is going to fall completely apart, and Hitler's going to achieve a dominant campaign in the East. This is primarily how these big battles are fought. Now, I know this looks messy. I just wanted you to see these arrows. These arrows here. So as the Germans launch their blitzkriegs, one group will head south, one group will head north, and they will push all the way through, and they will begin to drive behind and surround these massive pockets, because the Soviet troops in the center cannot retreat out of the way fast enough. And so this is primarily how these massive Soviet numbers get captured. These are called encirclements, and you should write this down. 100,000 Soviet troops are captured at the Battle of Uman. 100,000 is a massive number. That's how many Soviet troops were encircled by the German blitzkriegs. But that's a little one compared to Minsk, where 500,000 are encircled. And the Battle of Kiev, this is the food supply, remember? This is the spot that they can't lose or they will surely all starve. 700,000 Soviet troops, Red Army, are encircled at the Battle of Kiev. These huge pockets of Soviet armies are now trapped behind German lines. There is no retreat, there is no resupply, and there is no reinforcements. Some of these armies fall and surrender, are wiped out. Some dug in and become a bit of a problem, because as the blitzkriegs move, their supply lines get longer and longer and longer. And with these massive Soviet armies now in the backfield, behind the front line, there is some disruption to the blitzkrieg supply lines. So Germany literally had to turn their blitzkriegs around and drive them backwards to go deal with these massive armies that they've trapped. The Red Army loses 4.5 million troops in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. I need you to understand how massive that number is. 4.5 million is not small. Since the very first war that the United States has ever found itself in, the war against the pirate states, the Barbary states of North Africa, all the way back at the founding of our country until the modern wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you total up all of the deaths, all of the casualties, we do not hit 4.5 million. The Red Army loses more troops in the first 2 months of Operation Barbarossa than the United States has ever lost in any war combined. That is a big, big number. A number that would sink almost any country. But the Soviet Union has one advantage over the Nazis, and that is population. There are Russians to spare. So these rear cleanup missions, this buys Stalin and the Red Army some time, and they need all the time they can get. The next thing that they do is they start employing the favorite old Russian tactic of scorched earth. This is where they allow the advancing armies, and they did this with Napoleon, they did this during World War I as well. They allow the advancing army to take their ground. They back up, they retreat a little bit, and they allow their country to be captured little by little. And before it is captured, they burn everything. They burn all the food, they destroy buildings, they destroy anything that would be of use. They destroy any machinery that's of value. They deny the Nazis any sort of resupply, any sort of aid, and they complicate this invasion. And so rather than getting food supplies locally, the Germans have to get it from all the way back in Berlin. And it has to drive or be carried by horse all the way to the front lines. And these front lines, while they are moving further and further into Russian territory, the USSR has a big territory. They have a lot of ground to give. And if you burn all of it as the Nazis take it, then the Nazi supply lines get stretched thinner and thinner and thinner. The Red Army was massacred during these opening months of the invasion of Operation Barbarossa. But Russia has a massive population, and so they draw on huge numbers, and they begin to rebuild. The Russian people flock to defend the motherland. And so, even though they've lost millions, the army is also gaining millions and millions. And so the Red Army is rebuilding, and it is learning lessons, and it is preparing for a fight. And finally, the Soviet Union has run out of land. They have scorched all of it, and the Nazis have occupied all of it. And so Stalin decides to make a stand at the 3 cities that they have left. If you remember, Kiev was the food supply, and that is now gone, destroyed, burned. The 3 other cities that are left are Stalingrad, Leningrad, and the capital, Moscow. The Nazis reach both Leningrad and Moscow's outer defensive lines by the end of 1941. So in less than a year, in about 6 months, the Nazis have plowed from the Polish border all the way through to the Russian capital cities. The southern group is heading towards Stalingrad. And now think about this situation. The Nazis have an entire scorched earth campaign behind them with very stretched, very tenuous supply lines. It's hard to get enough stuff to the front to supply their mechanized divisions, enough fuel, enough food, enough supplies, reinforcements, troops, all of that, to keep that offensive working. And think about the Soviet perspective. They can't lose these cities. They will fight with everything they have, tooth and nail, to defend them, down to the last Russian, if that's what it takes. But they have no food. Kiev has already fallen. So the Russians are out of food, and the German supplies are stretched very thin as the largest invasion force in history meets the most stubborn dictator of the 20th century. And they will meet each other, and they will face each other finally in a stand-up fight of pride during the coldest winter on record in the 20th century. Okay. That's the end of this lecture. I know that it's shorter than the others. We will pick this back up later when we cover what happens here and what happens at the sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad and Moscow. And then we'll see some turning points in the war. Okay, write down stuff that you think is relevant. All of this is testable, and I will see you in class next time.